Happy Friday. Hello, folks. Sorry, I'm a little bit late for my 12 o'clock, but I won't keep you long. It's been a really crazy week. Crazy week. And here in Washington, you really feel the impact, as I know people around the country and around the world do, the new administration. But given that lots of folks here work for the federal government, some of the impact in terms of jobs and in terms of people being terminated and that are pretty dramatic. A lot of young people who turn down really good jobs to do something passionate, working for government agencies, but who were only a few months or a year in, may have been terminated. So there's just a lot of local impact. Good number of people in privacy, I think, were recently impacted as well in terms of the Office of Privacy Management. And I do think that, privacy's been a bipartisan issue for many years. It's been an issue that Republicans deeply, cared about. And, for many years, Republicans perhaps were more, shall we say, business friendly than Democrats when it came to regulating the private sector, but recognized that you wanted controls on government. And the whole notion of having databases that are created in government that have information about us and the kinds of things that government can do. Republicans would argue we don't need a law that tells a business to do this or that. I mean, what's the worst thing? You'll get an ad or something that you don't like. But government, we recognize that government can lock you up and prosecute you and all that. So we certainly want strong controls on how government controls and uses data. The first president to talk about privacy in the State of the Union speech was Republican President Richard Nixon. So I do hope that we see a settling of reality that you do need the appropriate protections and controls and process over the management of the data that our federal government holds. More broadly, one of the things that I've been talking to people about on both sides of the Atlantic, now we have a good team in Singapore and in India, I've got to say, on both sides of all the oceans. But this week I was in London for a bit. So let's say both sides of the Atlantic. Is what does the role, how does the current upheaval in regulation and AI and legislation affect the role of the senior people working in privacy? And I think we're still going to figure this out, but I do have a couple of thoughts that I thought might be useful to share. When I started out, privacy was much less regulated, and the roles that were starting to be created were senior executive roles. They had these important titles like Chief Privacy Officer. They had budgets, and they had an internal component, but also often a very big external component, talking to media, government affairs, playing an executive role on brand and trust and relationship with the board of directors. I reported directly to the board, actually, in my first role. And I don't mean just had the opportunity to report to the board. I was formally a board report. Now, the reality was, even though the role was created with this notion that it would be, a board report, you're an executive at a company, the CEO is in charge. But I certainly was a standing participant at board meetings because of this, even when most of those meetings didn't necessarily deal with with privacy, and certainly gave me, at least in theory, a certain role and stature. And many of those roles were created in a way that gave them that executive role because they were not very focused and very substantially and only focused on legal compliance. It was understanding where the law was going and what consumers were going to do and what their reactions were. And I think what has happened in recent years as privacy around the world has become an increasingly regulated area, that doesn't mean important, that there aren't high stakes, but companies know how to deal with regulation. They have legal departments, they have compliance departments, and when there is law on the books, there is an infrastructure to manage that. Many organizations had both a legal and a compliance and a privacy division, and then a public policy group that might also have privacy involved. And in recent year or two, I think we've seen a bit of a diminution of the sort of highly titled role. And let's not look at Apple and Google, where prominent CPOs left and were replaced, but not by people with the same exact scope or title, because they're not really representative given the size and the scale and that sort of thing. It's interesting, it's important, but I've seen a much broader impact on another range of companies where perhaps my day-to-day contact with the company was both their privacy lead and their legal privacy lead. And the privacy lead may be gone, and some of those staff are now on the legal privacy side. So that's definitely been a trend, and maybe just a natural one when you go from a frothy area to a more regulated area. Doesn't mean there's less resources, doesn't mean it's not as important, but the nature of the role may end up being a very senior compliance person and a very senior legal person, as opposed to sort of this freestanding executive department. When this trend took place, however, the AI world blew up, an area of uncertainty and not regulated, and a lot of drama around what's right, what's wrong. Advocates and academics and others who were experts having big voices in arguing for concerns that they saw about bias, about big tech, about discrimination, about climate change. And in the US, certainly a very friendly administration responding to those, incorporating those concerns in the executive order for accelerating government use of AI, but reflecting all of those concerns and processes to deal with them, and the beginning of many states starting to put in bills as well. And so many of the senior privacy folks, given that many of the concerns, but not all, and maybe not even most, were automated decisions, were AI regulatory, but really data protection regulatory concerns. GDPR has extensive regulation before we even talk about the EU AI Act for automated decisioning. California is doing a huge rulemaking around automated decisioning based on some language in its privacy law. And so many of the privacy leads naturally expanded, pivoted, took on significant roles in AI regulation and AI ethics, and other related areas. You'll see, if you just take a look at the organizations listed as members on our site, you'll see how many of them now have AI in their title and role, and that perhaps was a future proofing, or sort of the future direction of where these roles would go. And here we are now in what appears to be well, I don't want to predict it yet, but certainly a big change in the dynamic around AI regulation. On one hand, we still have lots of states putting in AI bills, but a lot of pushback that if there's a discrimination type component, well, that makes it sort of woke or Biden era. Pushback that startups won't be able to manage those sorts of rules. Pushback that we need to win against the world, against China on AI, and therefore shouldn't have heavy-handed regulation. And exactly how that'll play out, I don't know. Lots of legislators, certainly at the state level, and I think at the federal level, who are enthusiastic about AI, as I am. And when I think of bias and discrimination, yes, I see the concerns that AI can accelerate, but I also see the opportunities to resolve concerns or to be more fair. We've always said that humans are biased and humans in the loop are biased, and it's really hard to know when I didn't hire you for a job, whether it was because of your skin color or whether it was because of your skills. Doing this in a much more rigorous AI-driven way could be more fair, and you need a lot of data to make sure your AI is not biased. Good data. And so lots of areas where I think there's good reason to be optimistic that if with the right safeguards, we end up with a fair world, a better world. So I'm definitely on the enthusiast and optimist side, or at least wanting to see that opportunity. And I think that's where a lot of policymakers are. So I don't know yet, but I do see the pushback. And to the extent that today, there's also a huge drive to go forward. I mean, look, many of the big tech companies had technology somewhere in the same ballpark, whether ChatGPT, OpenAI was bigger, better, faster, I don't know. But, there were advanced models. You see how quickly the Googles and Metas and others sort of followed, with their releases. And so much of what was holding some of those back were the very negative reactions to AI being bigoted, the Microsoft chatbot that was foul mouth, the concerns that these things weren't accurate. And when OpenAI sort of surprised the world with how advanced ChatGPT was, the floodgates opened and people made the decision to rush forward because of the useful benefits, the utility, the way science was advancing, because of the use of generative AI, and the pressure to therefore not hold back because of policy, legal concerns. Look, the whole IP issue is still, for some debate. And so how do you today, if your role is legal compliance around AI, how do you, hold back, hey, this is going to be inaccurate, this is going to be biased, when you don't have a regulatory structure. So I think it's a challenging time for folks who are pivoting to AI with the notion that this was, going to be a lot of challenging, rules to comply with, although many of them not yet law, which is sort of, again, that was the heyday of the privacy role. Now you need someone to help navigate this, this confusion and this complexity. And so it may be that AI and the lack of clarity of how AI is regulated in the US creates opportunity because organizations will need guidance, but also a strong desire to not be held back. And so maybe that will lead to, significant roles helping shape this. But it also might lead to companies simply being comfortable with sort of the regulatory structure that exists today of federal law. Globally, I think there's quite a difference. We already have, a global infrastructure of challenging hard compliance with GDPR, EUA kicking in, the intersection of all the European laws. So I think, huge complexity. But again, that doesn't mean I need a chief privacy officer. I have a DPO, I have legal compliance. So I think we're at an interesting turning point, and I don't know which way it goes. It could end up being frothy. And frothy, again, is traditionally been a driver of needing senior executives to help navigate when it's complicated and conflicting, but yet regulatory. Again, there's a lot of work. And let me not suggest that therefore is that it is bad for the sector or it's bad for privacy because you don't have $1 million paid senior executives. You now have senior lawyers and senior compliance people working and being technical experts and legal experts in a fairly complex area. That doesn't change the number of people who need to engage with FPF, need to go to an IAPP conference, need to get certified, need to learn and discuss, and so on and so forth, right? The field as a whole will be fine, but exactly the nature of the senior executive role, for us OGs who kind of came up in that manner, I think huge uncertainty. Just two other quick notes before I let you go. One, many in the Jewish community, in the pro-Israel community, or hopefully anybody who sees sort of the pain, of the Bibas family, these two young children, babies really, who were held hostage and then murdered evidently by Hamas. If you follow this closely, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't follow it too closely, you're obviously aware there were, a huge number of hostages, grabbed. Two of them were really babies, and they were sort of orange-haired babies, and they really caught in a very emotional way the attention of the world and of everyone in the country. And they were returned dead this week. They were supposed to be returned with their mother. A body was returned, and it was not their mother. So again, another terrible twist. When the bodies were returned, there was a giant ceremony with children on stage cheering on the Gaza side, so proud of the fact that these dead bodies were being returned. It was really, horrifically ghoulish. So anyway, huge impact, and certainly in my family, there are a lot of tears and sadness. And then the last thing, Apple today, I guess, maybe yesterday in the news today, is withdrawing encrypted cloud backups in the UK because of the UK's demand that Apple provide a backdoor. We've talked so many times about how there is no safe, secure way to create a mathematical flaw in encryption that allows access for government that doesn't end up creating a flaw that could allow access to anybody. The telcos in the US have been compromised because of backdoor access that was created in order to cooperate with legal mandatory law enforcement requests. And so moving in this direction just seems foolish. And I get that the law enforcement people want it because there are times where there's data that they want to get. And if there was some magic way to guarantee that only good companies with good law enforcement, with good process, somehow have access in a way that does not create any technical risk for bad actors getting it, or the same demands being available to bad governments, bad actors, or governments that we don't trust are operating always 100% under the support for democratic values that we like, which can exist anywhere. So it's been a never-ending debate. It's disappointing to see the UK drive in this direction, and fully expected to see Apple saying, well, then we won't offer a flawed product at all because we don't want to compromise encryption globally. I hope the UK will reconsider. Anyway, happy Friday. Thanks for catching up with me, friends, and look forward to talking next week.